I play Pokémon HeartGold version.
I play Pokémon.
I collect Pokémon, trade them, and engage. I use mine when I run. Took 5,000 steps. What about you? I use
Pokémon HeartGold.
Pokémon HeartGold and SoulSilver are games that define the golden age of Pokémon, and are titles that were beloved by all. The fans who played the originals loved how they were adapted, the critics sung its praises, and most of all, the younger audience loved them, and I was a part of that last group. Adventuring around Johto with my Meganium, who was significantly overleveled because I didn't use any other Pokemon on my team, defined my childhood, and I attribute these games to be the main reason as to why I still love this series today. And after growing older and witnessing the countless controversies that would plague my favorite series today, I looked at HeartGold and SoulSilver as the pinnacle of the series. Something that didn't represent all the negatives that Pokemon eventually became known for, and most importantly, would never be topped in the future. That was my reality of Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver. Or so I thought it was. Recently, I decided to pick up these games again, ready to re-experience some peak Pokemon. But as I progressed through the game, the smile on my face slowly started to fade, and the further I got in, the more cracks started to show. But no, this can't be right! These are great Pokemon games, everyone loves them! They're the highest rated Pokemon titles on Metacritic, there's so many videos online talking about how great they are! Do I just feel like being different? Am I in the wrong? As someone who's made videos criticizing the modern era of Pokemon, I thought it was time to take a deep dive into everything wrong in the region of Johto, and talk about some flaws that I feel have been overlooked for the past 15 years. Or 25 years, I guess, because everything I'm about to say can also apply to the originals as well, but putting Gold, Silver, HeartGold, and SoulSilver in the title sounds like a mouthful, so I only put the remakes names instead. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Anyways, let's talk about... Alright, let me preface this section by saying Pokemon designs are completely subjective. What you value and what makes a good Pokemon design can be completely different from what I consider to be a good Pokemon design. Every generation will have their more humanoid or objects with eyes designs, and that's completely fine. Let people like what they want to like. Cool? We got that? Alright, good. Now with that said, all these guys surrounding me right now are fucking awful. Okay, I know that sounds like a complete contradiction to what I just said 30 seconds ago, but when I say objectively, I don't mean that Pokemon like Lantern or Xatu should be considered bad. Hell, I wouldn't even judge you if you were to say Ledian is your favorite Pokemon. I'm trying to say on a... No, that's a lie. I definitely would. Who the fuck likes that thing? I'm trying to say on a fundamental level that this is an incomplete Pokedex, and I can prove that using numbers. Out of the 100 Pokemon introduced in this generation, 15 of them are complete by obligation, which of course are the starters and the legendaries, and this makes sense. They're the most prominent Pokemon in the game, therefore they need more attention. Then we go on to the evolutions of past Pokemon from Kanto, which includes both pre and post evolutions, which makes up a surprisingly pretty high number at 19, which makes for a number that is pretty damn low. But if you take a real close look at the Pokemon that's left, you start to realize, wow, a lot of these Pokemon are carried by their evolutions that they got in future games, and the way they are now are pretty lame. And you're right, Pokemon like Yanmar, Apom are so underbaked without their evolutions, and while we have others like Sneasel who are pretty decent on their own, it doesn't really matter since its stats are horrible. Which means if we take out all the unfinished Pokemon lines, our total would come down to 44. And I can decrease that number even more if we take into consideration Megas and Paradox forms. But that's just overkill at that point. And as for the rest of the lineup, we have only 3 that are fully fleshed out 3-stage evolution lines. The Hoppip line, Mareep line, and Larvitar line. And let's be honest with ourselves for a second. The Larvitar line is really cool, but it's also super rare, only being found in one area super late into the game. And the Hoppip line, sucks ass. So we really only have one 3-stage evolution that is viable throughout your playthrough. I tried doing the same thing with generations 3 and 4, and the numbers look so much better in comparison, especially when you look at Sinnoh, which not only had a bunch of iconic new Pokemon, but was also tasked with giving evolutions to Gen 2 Pokemon who desperately needed one, which was secretly a way for Game Freak to tell the fans that, yeah, we messed up hard by making so many Gen 2 Pokemon useless. And that sentiment is still being shown till this very day, where Johto Pokemon are still getting evolutions in recent titles, and judging how there's still a handful of them that still need a lot of help, we're probably gonna get even more in the future. Which brings up a point you've probably already asked by now, which is, dude, how can you say all that when HeartGold and SoulSilver fixed that issue? All of the Pokemon that you said were unfinished are finally given evolutions, which are now available in this game. And also your hair looks really stupid. Which, first off, wow, I'm actually kind of hurt from that. I literally got a haircut specifically for this section, but whatever. But also, yes, these evolutions are in this game, which should make these Johto natives feel more useful. But somewhat hard counterpoint, how am I supposed to use any of these cool new Pokemon if you can barely find them to begin with? The Johto region is supposed to be filled with Johto Pokemon, right? Right? Well, no, actually, because no matter where you look, all of the Pokemon you're going to encounter are more often than not going to be from Kanto. Initially, when playing through the game, I chalked it up to me just having bad luck, but when I searched the actual encounter rates for each route and city, I found that, no, the game really doesn't want you to find anything from Gen 2. To further prove my point, I made a very scuffed spreadsheet of Kanto to Johto Pokemon encounter rates found in every route and city, and the final numbers are even weirder than I thought they'd be, with the exception of Route 43 and 45. In literally every other area, you have a better chance of finding a Kanto Pokemon than a Johto Pokemon. And by the way, I've taken into account headbutting trees and dismissing version exclusives, so the number of Johto Pokemon you can find is probably even less than what it already is now. I already know that people are going to start mentioning the Safari Zone and how it fixes this issue, and while I can sort of see where they're coming from, personally, I think it makes the situation feel even more lazy. Instead of using the remakes as an opportunity to actually have Johto Pokemon native in the habitats and where they should belong in, they just dump a whole bunch of them in one area and call it a day. In fact, the remakes have some Pokemon even rarer than they were in the original 3 games, which again should be an easy fix, but Game Freak didn't decide to implement it. And better yet, when you do get the opportunity to use a Johto Pokemon that got an evolution, the game makes it incredibly hard to evolve. Togepi is given to you at the very start of the game. In fact, it's the reason why you set off on your journey in the first place, and I thought it was the perfect opportunity to actually use it on my team since I never did before. So I hatched it and trained it up until it became a Togetic, and by the time I got to the 7th gym, it became apparent that I had to evolve it again before it started to lag behind the rest of my team. So I searched up the faded words on Google, where to find Shiny Stone in SoulSilver, and apparently you have to wait until you get Rock Climb in order to find the stone. You get Rock Climb after getting all 16 gym badges, meaning you're stuck with a Togetic for 99% of your playthrough. Game Freak, this is one of the most important Pokemon in the game. Why the fuck did you do this to us? I know that the inability to evolve my boy Eggert might come off as a nitpick, but it makes it feel as though that getting all these new evolutions was actually just a big waste of time, since barely any of them are actually obtainable. Here's another spreadsheet I made to prove that. This one didn't really need a spreadsheet, but I wanted to make one anyways. But either way, this and the awful encounter rates make Johto Pokemon feel more like a rare luxury than creatures that inhabit the region they came from. Especially when it comes to Pokemon like the Skarmory and Slugma line, Pokemon that I swore came from Hoenn, but were actually first revealed in Johto. And apparently, a lot of other fans thought the exact same thing as me, because those Pokemon have more of a presence in those games since they're actually accessible and gym leaders use them in battle. Do you know who hates the Johto Pokedex more than I do? Just take a look at the people who are supposed to represent this region. This is another big issue regarding these games that people have already highlighted in the past, but I still need to talk about it myself because It's so nonsensical and stupid to the point where I swear Game Freak was trying to play a funny prank on us. Because what the hell is this lineup? Falkner, Bugsy, Morty, and Chuck's team is fully composed of Gen 1 Pokemon, and if we remove the Kanto tax off the other gym leaders, the only unique Johto Pokemon found in the gym challenge are Miltank and Piloswine. That's it! And I already explained that the Johto Dex is very, very unimpressive, but there are Pokemon that can be easily added or substituted in. The Hoot Hoot line is right there. Ledian and Ariados fit Bugsy's team way more than Scyther does, and come on, we only got one new Ghost type in Johto, and yet Morty still decides to use 2 Haunter on his team instead? It's just brain dead decisions made even funnier from the fact that Game Freak had 2 chances to right their wrongs and give these gym leaders better teams in Crystal or the remakes, yet they still decide to leave them as is. And the thing is, Game Freak has shown that they aren't afraid to change up certain teams to benefit gym leaders. Watson's team in Ruby and Sapphire was pretty lacking, so in Emerald he actually uses Electric-type Pokemon from Hoenn, making it fit more in line for a Hoenn gym leader. And then they went on to butcher that in our ass. But we're not talking about those games right now. Every gym leader refuses to use any Gen 2 Pokemon, which feels very lazy and only adds to my point of Johto Pokemon feeling more like a rare luxury. And speaking of lazy, the Johto gyms in general, 3 Gs, that's kind of funny, feel more lazily designed than most other regions, specifically when it comes to the puzzles. Now, I'm not trying to say that the gym leader puzzles are supposed to be hard or something. Apparently, Pokemon is supposed to be a game for kids, which is unheard of for me, but if that's the case, then obviously I shouldn't be expecting some Divine Beast-ass puzzle for us to do. But I'm more so talking about how exactly the gyms themselves feel very uncreative and uninspired. Whitney just has a bunch of blocks laying around. Chuck's gym has you fight 1 trainer and push a single button. Even Jasmine, someone who's supposed to be one of the more advanced gym leaders in the game, doesn't actually have anything. Her gym has no puzzles or even trainers for that fact. It just has 2 people who be like, yo, thanks for curing Ampharos of cancer. And that's it, that's all they want to say. There is literally nothing to note of here, and no one ever talks about how dull this is. Raihan, the last gym leader of Galar, who rightfully got flamed for having essentially no gym, still does a better job than whatever Jasmine's gym is, because at least you actually get to fight some trainers in the middle of it. And also, it's kind of cool fighting in this big medieval tower, I guess. But no, everyone gives him shit, while Jasmine gets off scot-free. And like, okay, I get it, Jasmine's hot, so she gets more of a pass. But Raihan's pretty hot as well! Okay, so the Pokemon suck and the gyms suck, which, you know what, is fine. Not everything has to be perfect, or in this case, even good. So how about we turn our way to a different aspect of the Johto games, and take a look at how it handles the story. It sucks, guys. The story really fucking sucks, guys. Bar none, Pokemon Gold, Silver, Crystal, HeartGold, SoulSilver, and eventually Let's Go Togepi and Marill have the worst story in Pokemon game history. Now, Pokemon games aren't known for their riveting plot lines or anything, but Johto specifically feels so much more paper thin and just plain stupid compared to everything that came before and after it. And it mainly has to do with the villains of the game, Team Rocket. Again, as they try their luck in the Johto region after their last endeavors failed 3 years ago. And on paper, I like and sort of dislike this idea. On one hand, it could be interesting to see how Team Rocket would go about righting their wrongs, and seeing what kind of different ways they'll go about doing that. But also, it makes this game lack some originality, since the evil teams are such a big part of what makes a Pokemon game stand out, and just rehashing a team from before can feel very lazy depending on how they go about it. And the way Game Freak handles it is so much worse than you can possibly imagine. First off, Team Rocket doesn't actually have that much of a presence in the story. The people of Johto don't really treat them as some massive threat, and besides some miscellaneous encounters, you only actually deal with them on 3 separate occasions, which makes them feel super disconnected from the rest of the game, especially since their plot is paced pretty poorly as well. The first encounter in the Slowpoke Well happens after you get your first gym badge, and the very next time you see them isn't until after you get your 6th gym badge, so if you're not paying attention, you could forget they're in the game at all, because they basically don't even show up for half the game. But you know, I could mostly excuse this if these encounters were super climactic or exciting, but no, they really suck. Let's go through all 3 of them. The first time you deal with them is in a Slowpoke tunnel, where you find out that Team Rocket are cutting off Slowpoke tails to make money, I guess. Which, like, fine. I know that Team Rocket's whole thing is to make some profit, but I feel like there's better ways to go about it. And also, it's just kinda lame. While the Team Rocket in the other games are offing Marowak and taking people hostage, they're over here cutting off some Slowpoke tails that can eventually grow back. Wait, if they can grow back, why don't they just catch one Slowpoke and cut off its tail once in a while? How is this a rare item again? So the next time you encounter them is in Mahogany Town, where you infiltrate their secret base after finding out that they were the ones behind the Red Gyarados incident. And this should sound pretty cool. Who doesn't like a good old secret hideout raid under a non-conspicuous area? Wait, doesn't that feel a little bit familiar to you? Oh yeah, that's because we already fucking did that! In the Red and Blue games, you also infiltrate Team Rocket's hideout in Celadon City, but there is a good reason as to why it was there. Since they were located underneath the game corner, which is ran by them in the first place so they could sell Pokemon at high prices. Here, there is no good reason for them to be hidden underneath some random souvenir shop, and the whole infiltration feels less exciting when you realize that you've done all this before. Only this time, there's no more Giovanni, which then brings us to the last major encounter of Team Rocket, the Goldenrod Tower operation, where the entirety of Team Rocket invades Radio Tower for a last-ditch effort to contact their old boss, which personally is the final nail in the Team Rocket you are so pathetically sad coffin. Because throughout this whole game, you might think that their main goal is to seek vengeance, or to make a whole bunch of bread like last time, but no, their actual main plan is to find out where exactly Giovanni went after he got beat by Red, using the radio waves of the Goldenrod Tower. And after understanding their true plans, it finally clicked as to why they seem so underwhelming. All of their actions in this game isn't something an evil team would do. No. This is the work of glazers. We are currently trying to take down a group of people who do nothing else but try to glaze Giovanni, doing operations that would theoretically get the money and putting secret bases under unsuspectful areas, all as an act to try to get him back and get in his pants. That's all they are in this game. And it's funny too, since the director of the radio tower offhandedly mentions that, oh, if they take control of the radio tower, they might be able to brainwash all the Pokemon in Johto. But none of the Team Rocket members say anything about that. All they want to do is get Giovanni back so they can suck him off. And this might be more of a personal thing, but I just think the whole Goldenrod Tower climax is such a big downgrade compared to every other final standoff with the evil team. I understand that the final showdowns are usually the exact same thing, but here, the stakes and just overall atmosphere feels a lot more shallow. Here, let me show you what I mean. After the leaders of Team Aqua and Magma awaken the personification of the land and sea itself, they're unable to control their powers, thus reawakening a 1,000-year-old rivalry that can spell the end of the Hoenn region as we know it. And with millions of innocent civilians on the line, it's up to you to seek out the God of the Sky to quell their rages and save the entirety of Hoenn from these beings of unimaginable power. Defeat a team that has severe daddy issues. Travel to another dimension to seek out Lily's mother, a character who has gone insane after the passing of her husband and turned her attention to the Ultra Beasts, which she believed to be the definition of pure beauty. An obsession that literally poisoned her mind to the point that it traumatized her kids and drove a wedge in between her remaining family, which all culminates in Luzamine combining with an extra-dimensional being which in her mind thinks will finally let her achieve total beauty, but in actuality turned her into the one thing she never wanted to be: a monster. Go up a building with 5 floors to stop a phone call. I get that Gold and Silver are very early Pokemon games, and perhaps Game Freak didn't figure out how to properly build stakes and set an atmosphere, but even the Kanto games feel much more climactic than this. Especially since it had the mini plot twist of Giovanni being the final gym leader of the game, which segues perfectly into the biggest thing that pisses me off about the game story: the big bad villain. These characters can make or break a game. I can admit that Team Flare, despite having some swaggy outfits, are a pretty meh evil team. But Lysander is a pretty cool leader though. He just gives off a certain type of aura that could have made him a top tier villain, but he's still pretty good all around. Every villain that comes out of Game Freak was amazing at best and serviceable at worst. And then you compare all of them to this guy. Yep, this is the big evil villain of the Gen 2 games, and he is the most forgettable guy ever. First off, you only come across him once. While other villains are shown off early on and are slowly built up throughout the story, this blue-haired ass bitch shows up at the top of Goldenrod Tower and disappears afterwards. He doesn't have any sort of distinguishable features like that weird red monocle Getsis has, or some kind of interesting personality that makes guys like Archie sort of memorable. He's given nothing. He's just a placeholder for Team Rocket, who exists just as a means for having a final confrontation, in which after you beat him, he's just like, welp, we tried. Time to go home now. This dude is such a disgrace to every other villain in the series. No charisma or endless drive to complete their goals. He's just a hollow body that is used to fill the villain role. And Game Freak absolutely knew that they did not cook with him at all, because they never bothered to give this guy his own theme or a name, which is usually a staple for Pokemon villains in every... What? Wait a minute. This guy wasn't given a fucking name? He was so irrelevant and forgettable, to the point where even the people who made him didn't give him the luxury of having a name until 10 years after he was introduced. A name that is... pretty cool, all things considered, but that's besides the point. But by far, the saddest part is, there was some potential for this idea to be carried out in a better way. Like I stated before, the idea of an evil organization trying to rebuild themselves to their former glory seems pretty cool, but these games go about it in the most pathetic way possible. And the mastermind behind everything was a character so insignificant and pointless, instead of focusing more on Giovanni's supposed wife or Giovanni's long-lost son or something. Now, with all that said, let's talk about Giovanni's long-lost son. I think the majority of Pokemon fans can agree that Silver is one of the best or the best rival in the series, and for the most part, I agree with that sentiment. At first, he almost seems like a carbon copy of Gary, just a douchebag who acts like he's better than everyone else until you ultimately crush his spirits. But unlike Gary, Silver, or Barney as I named in my playthrough, actually starts to change a lot throughout your many encounters with him in the game. He starts to question his ideals, he slowly becomes less cold with you, and treats you as an equal. He even rethinks his treatment of his Pokemon, and it creates a really cool redemption story for his character, which comes full circle in your last battle with him, where his Golbat that he's had for the longest time finally evolves into a Crobat, which is only possible if you max out its friendship. And then we also have his relationship with Giovanni, and again, I love that this is here in HeartGold and SoulSilver, adding some context as to why Silver really hated Team Rocket, and also why exactly he's so cold and misguided. And that scene of him confronting his dad before he leaves to get Moo Moo Milk is amazing, and adds such a complex layer to both of these characters. So why the fuck is it locked behind a timed event? Look, I'm glad that this is here, I really am, but it just feels like a bit of a cop-out that's locked behind the Celebi event and isn't actually integrated into the game's main story. It brings so much more depth to the games, and it has to do with characters we actually care about instead of dealing with the remnants of Team Blazers. There's a real emotional aspect to the plot, which would have made it much more engaging to follow the ongoing turmoil between Giovanni and Silver in a similar way to how the ongoing issues of Luzamine's family was integrated into the overarching plot of Sun and Moon, which in my opinion made it one of the most compelling stories in all of Pokemon. And it would have been kinda cool to have some sort of final stand with the player in Silver versus Giovanni and Archer, where in this scenario, Giovanni is so ashamed that Silver never became a part of Team Rocket, so he decided to devote his attention to Arthur, who he now calls his real son. That way Archer can keep his cookie cutter personality because he was raised by such a terrible guy, and this final confrontation teleportation would act as a good way to conclude Team Rocket's saga and Silver's story. And a part of me feels like Game Freak did want to incorporate Silver and Giovanni's relationship into the final game, but due to time constraints and other priorities, they had to put it in the Celebi event instead, while we have a double battle with Lance and Claire in the post-game. And our actual final stand with Giovanni happens in some random cave, and once you beat him, he supposedly throws himself into the river. Pretty boring way to go out, by the way. Playing through SoulSilver again and seeing how much the story lacked in terms of substance and how much missed potential there is, it unironically made me have a newfound appreciation for Pokemon's Sword and Shield story, because at the very least, it had a vision. Eternatus and the history of the Darkest Day was foreshadowed throughout your entire adventure, and for how nonsensical and idiotic Rose's motivation was, there was some kind of heart behind it. A heart that drove him insane for protecting Galar's future in any way possible, and gave us a climax with Gigantamax Eternatus. An actual threat to the people of the region that gave us some sort of stakes, not whatever radio tower bullshit we gotta do here. And yet people still go on to complain about how awful this story is when Gold and Silver is right there with something that is so much worse. The Sword and Shield story still isn't good though. It's like comparing a 4 out of 10 to a 2 out of 10. Dear God, this guy's gonna try to convince me that the legendary Pokemon of this region are bad? You probably just said, and no, actually, this is far from that. And personally, in terms of quality and quantity-wise, this is one of the best the entire series has to offer. Lugia and Ho-Oh have amazing designs. The color palette of Ho-Oh is phenomenal, and Lugia and his big-ass hands are super dope. And the origins of the 3 legendary dogs are among the most interesting the world of Pokemon has to offer, and helps the world building of Johto as a whole. And the Celebi movie was pretty okay. So in terms of their designs and lore, the Johto Legendaries can't be considered bad, but my problems start to arise when it comes to how exactly they are portrayed in the Johto games. Because if you really pay attention to what they actually contribute to, you'll quickly realize that they're pretty much irrelevant. But to really explain what I mean, let me first pose a question. What makes a good box legendary? Surely having a great design is a part of it, but in my opinion, it's based on how much of an influence they have on the game. For example, it was essential for Cyrus to awaken Dialga and Palkia because they have the power to accomplish his dreams of creating a new universe. Lysander, while his dream was a lot more logical, needed Xerneas and Yveltal to create the ultimate weapon, which he knew he needed because of what happened 3,000 years ago. And Scarlet and Violet took a different approach to this, since the legendaries aren't really needed to recreate some big doomsday device, but they're the result of the Professor shenanigans down in Area Zero, and also how they're your best friend, and essential for you to make bonds with others and get around the region. That's why they're boxed legendaries. They encapsulate everything the story needs in order to function, and if you take away their presence, their absence would show on the box cover itself. And also because 8-year-olds think they look really cool. As a former 8-year-old myself, I can confirm that Groudon looks really fucking awesome. But if you apply the same logic to Lugia and Ho-Oh, the games can still functionally work. Their absence would literally change nothing at all. Team Rocket is too busy trying to get Giovanni's schlong, and there's no world-ending threat that needs their power in order to save. They just sit around in their respective areas and do nothing, just like some random MacGuffin. And the way you encounter them doesn't help their case either. Like literally in Gold and Silver, they're barely mentioned, and you can totally bypass them entirely. And HeartGold and SoulSilver try doing something a little better with a Kimono girl saying you're the chosen one or some BS, and make you go to the Bell Tower or Whirl Islands so they can summon them and you can go ahead and catch them. And these scenes are incredible. The music and the actual animation of Lugia bursting out of the waterfall or Ho-Oh descending on top of the tower is like a core memory inside my brain. But legitimately, there is no reason for us to be summoning them like this. We just invade their personal privacy and play some loud ass music so we can kidnap them in our balls. If you take a pair of scissors and completely cut this section section out of the game, nothing noteworthy would be affected by that, which is something I can't say for any other box legendary. Hell, even Game Freak doesn't even treat these legendaries as a big deal, while Groudon and Kyogre needed these mystical orbs which were sought out by large organizations. All you need here is one of their feathers. And where exactly do you get them? From this guy who you meet after you take care of Team Rocket, who just says, "Hey kid, thanks for single-handedly getting rid of that entire villain organization who held innocent civilians hostage. Here's a feather I found on the roof. Hope you like birds." That's it! It was just awkwardly shoved into the plot, so we have a reason to go visit Ho-Oh or Lugia. And again, you might pull out the "these games are old" card, and I understand that. This story represents Pokemon at a very early time in the series. It was the second mainline game, and maybe Game Freak never thought of at that point to incorporate the legendary Pokemon to the plot. But objection! I never played Phoenix right before. Is that how it works? Mewtwo, you know, a non-box legendary, still held significance to the plot of the Kanto games, because while he isn't specifically name-dropped by anyone, he is heavily foreshadowed. And the entirety of the Pokemon Mansion is used as a way to tell the history of its creation and the significance of it. Which can sort of apply for Ho-Oh, since it helped create the 3 legendary dogs, and Lugia, that doesn't apply to at all. I keep seeing this image online of, oh, legendary Pokemon before. I'm the god of water and the sea, blah, 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 blah. And then they compare that to legendaries now, which is just Sandwich. Well, that Sandwich, the one I'm pointing at right now, probably, has more story relevance than Lugia does in the entire series. And this is coming from a guy who has Lugia as one of his favorite legendaries. And the other legendaries are just there. They don't really contribute to anything other than Suicune's whole side plot, which is just a really long game of hide and seek. In the end, the best way I can describe the Johto legendaries as a whole is spectacle over storytelling. They look awesome, and I love their animation when you confront them, but they turn out to be so pointless in what's essentially their shining moment as legendaries. Okay, fine, I only learned that term recently, but I'm pretty sure that it applies here too. Throughout this entire video so far, I've juggled between talking about the original Gold and Silver games and the remakes, and while I can see people agreeing with my thoughts on the originals, they wouldn't say the same for HeartGold and SoulSilver, and how could they? The game fixes and adds so many elements that absolutely makes it feel like the definitive way to play these games. And while I 100% agree that these are really good remakes, as the years pass on, I start to second guess myself in terms of thinking they're absolutely perfect. But first off, let's talk about some positives, because Game Freak really did cook with some of the things that they added here. First and foremost, it's hard not to love the atmosphere the remakes give to Johto. The Kansai region of Japan, the one that Johto's based off, is known to have a stronger connection to its traditional culture, and likewise Johto tries to represent that the best it can. Many of the buildings or houses look a lot like what a traditional Japanese house can be, and much of the locations are based on places you'd find in Kansai itself. None more apparent than Ecruteak City, directly based on the cultural capital of Kyoto, and also where you can find the Burned and Bell Tower, which hold a lot of resemblance to structures that are found in real life. And the music helps fit that vibe as well, using a lot of traditional Japanese instruments such as the shamisen and hyasashi to create some beautiful and iconic remixes. The region of Johto is highly regarded as one of the most distinct and detailed regions in the series, and I'm inclined to agree with those statements with how it was represented here. And of course I have to bring up all the quality of life changes as well. The UI is incredibly easy to use, and the automatic run button, while small, is a great addition. And the following Pokemon mechanic? Dude! Dude! I can choose to be pessimistic and just say, oh, this is entirely cosmetic and adds nothing to the game, but even I can't be that cynical, and if I ever was, I deserve to be punched in the face for that, because this shit is awesome, and it is almost impossible to see someone say otherwise. Plus, all the additions to the post-game and extra content is a huge plus, and you can't forget about the Pokewalker, an awesome little gadget that came free with your copy of these games. At least I think they're awesome. I was too stupid to figure out how to use it as a kid. and I still can't use them now. All these things are what you typically see in your good old why HeartGold and SoulSilver are the best Pokemon games, and I would gladly sell my first newborn to experience playing them for the first time again. And that's where they usually stop. They don't often mention some of the critiques that I think are pretty valid to give, especially with something like a remake, which is supposed to fix previous problems or outdated things. The gym leader teams are still not a good representation of Johto Pokemon. The difficulty curve and level balancing is still as awful as it was in the originals. The level up movesets of Pokemon are still bad. These problems, in my opinion, should have been prioritized when making a remake, but instead we got all this other stuff, which is still cool, but sadly, it makes me think that the reason these remakes work so well is not because of what Game Freak specifically adds to them, but because the series simply evolved. And the developers just borrowed all the additions they previously made and implemented it here. The ability to run was first added in Ruby and Sapphire, so of course it would make an appearance here. The graphics look no different than they did in the Sinnoh games. Hell, the following Pokemon mechanic was literally in Diamond and Pearl. Alright, maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh right now. I'm literally just singling out these remakes when every other one has done the exact same thing to various levels of success. And it's not like Game Freak can make a remake that pays homage to the originals, but can also add new mechanics and gameplay methods that can make for a more fleshed out experience. And yeah, it kinda sucks too, because it feels like there's a lot of untapped potential when it comes to these old games, and it feels like a lot more can be done with them other than just changing the graphics. It's what I was about to say if Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire didn't already exist. The Hoenn remakes truly sets a brand new standard for Pokemon remakes that put all the rest of them to shame. For one, the amount of new additions not native anywhere else before is unheard of. The Dex Nav, soaring with Latios and Latias, new story beats, the game completely redesigned Marvel City into a mall, which they didn't have to do, but in doing so, makes it so much more unique than it was from before. Where's your city changes, HeartGold and SoulSilver? Mahogany Town is literally the most unappealing and bland place in any Pokemon game, and they're effectively unchanged in the remakes. Yes, you can't deny Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire does fall victim to some of the critiques I've stated about the Johto remakes, such as the unchanged gym leader teams, but in my opinion, I would say the things they added instead kinda makes up for it, like creating 17 new megas for us to use, giving more love to the region than before. But the crowning jewel of ORAS is the inclusion of the Delta episode. While HeartGold and SoulSilver honored Crystal by making a middle-aged man chase after a dog for 2 regions, here, to honor Emerald, we have an entirely new story revolving around Deoxys and Rayquaza, with the origin of Mega Evolution finally being explained to us and giving us the introduction of Zinnia, a character with a peak design and amazing backstory, all capped off with one of the coolest scenes in all of Pokemon. And after getting all this new content, it's only natural that these games are considered to be a severe downgrade from Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver. Why? Because it doesn't have the Battle Frontier, and HeartGold and SoulSilver do. Really? Like fucking really? This was the make or break moment? Like, okay, I get it. People love the Battle Frontier from Emerald and prayed we would get the same here. And the tease they gave us does feel pretty spiteful. But that's all it took to consider these inferior? Because the Johto remakes have a Battle Frontier? Also borrowed. Look, I don't want to outright say that these are bad remakes. They simply aren't. They replicate the original games to a T and add some fan favorite mechanics. But those things are just a facade for what the remakes actually should have added. And the existence of ORAS proves that they could have been a lot more ambitious. If I were to scale these remakes against each other, there would be a large margin in between each other. The Pokeathlon is pretty dope though. Up until this point, I've been critiquing many aspects of the Johto games, and these issues have been highlighted by other fans in the past. However, these critiques for the most part have been overshadowed by 5 simple words. 5 words that make it feel as though, no matter what kind of flaws these games could have, it will always be excused because these 5 words exist. And those 5 words are, dude, you can go to Kanto. Like, hey, that's cool and all, but these games barely have a story. Doesn't matter, you can go to Kanto. Yeah, but so many Johto Pokemon feel underdeveloped. Doesn't matter, you can go to Kanto. But Ledian is in this game. Doesn't matter, you can go to Kanto. No, you're right, Ledian does kind of suck. No matter how shitty or disappointing a game is, it can be redeemed if you can go to Kanto. Can you go to Kanto in Persona 5? No? Yeah, that's what I thought, because that game sucks. And now here's where I come in and try to tell you that this part actually sucks. So what exactly is my controversial opinion on the post-game? None, actually. This is like the coolest thing Game Freak's ever done. After first completing the Pokemon League and receiving an SS Sand ticket from Professor Elm, you get on a boat and travel to an entirely new region filled with new places to explore and, more importantly, 8 more gyms to conquer, which was such an insane mind blow when you experience it for the first time. I remember thinking, wow, everything I just played was basically only half the adventure? That's awesome! And they don't try going about it in a lazy way, but just copying what Kanto was from before. Since the events of the Red and Blue games happened 3 years ago, Game Freak took the opportunity to show what happened to the region in all that time. Characters and cities go through significant redesigns, some gym leaders have been replaced, and Cinnabar Island and all of its residents blew up. It's awesome! Traveling throughout Kanto with a brand new coat of paint is one of the best decisions the developers could have made as a reward for beating the main game. And it's something that the fans have wished to come back every time there's a new entry, and thankfully, HeartGold and SoulSilver chose to expand on this aspect. We get even more popular characters to interact with coming from Hoenn and Sinnoh. Gym leader rematches are here as well, in which Game Freak actually gives Johto leaders proper teams to face off against. The game just allows you to go catch Groudon and Kyogre. Is there a good reason for them to be hidden in some random cave in Johto? Of course not, but who fucking cares? It's post-game content, and Game Freak fully stuffed these games so our playtimes would last forever. But by far the coolest thing about all of this is what lies at the end of it all. After going through all 16 gyms and becoming champion, there is still one more hurdle for you to overcome, and that happens to be Mount Silver, a treacherous and tall winter mountain that no one dares to step into unless you've proven how strong you are. And after ascending to the peak, you find one other person, which of course we all know is Red, exchanging absolutely no words and only asking for a fight. And there is no other way to describe this battle other than peak. Because, you know, we're at the top of the mountain, which by Google's definition is considered to be peak. This shit is cool. Like, really cool. From the moment his iconic theme starts up, to seeing his Pikachu that is at a level that you thought was unheard of, there was truly no better way to close out this game other than with this battle. And it's a moment that first happened over 25 years ago, but people still question if it's been topped or not. The post-game of Gold and Silver is utterly fantastic because of the presence of Kanto, and is the main reason as to why these games are so beloved by every Pokemon fan. Which is exactly what the root problem of these games are. They rely on Kanto. Not that they borrow a ton of elements from the Kanto games, but Pokemon Gold and Silver physically can't function if it wasn't for the existence of their predecessors. The signs of this are plastered all over Johto. Many locations in the game are based off Pokemon from the original 151. The existence of shiny Pokemon were introduced in these games, and instead of using an Ampharos or a Lantern to show it off, they use Gyarados. Or the champion who's supposed to represent both the regions of Kanto and Johto exclusively uses Kanto Pokemon. And despite being called the Dragon Master, he owns more flying types than he does dragon types. Which isn't really a criticism, I just find it really funny. And I understand that the whole point is that the two regions are literally right beside each other, so naturally things from both areas will bleed into one another. But Kanto is the one bleeding so much more, to the point where it feels like Johto doesn't really have an identity. Let me present it like this. If this series never started with Gen 1 in Kanto and began anywhere else, for the most part, every mainline game can stand on their own 2 feet. Even though some Pokemon availability will take some hits, and some games would work a lot better than others, for the most part, these games can still function properly. However, I can't say the same for Gold, Silver, and Crystal, since so much of what makes them good is because of what's been previously firmly established. If Kanto was snapped out of existence, then Team Rocket would be gone, Silver would be gone because, you know, the entirety of the post-game would be gone, and a whole bunch of other things. And even more so regarding the remakes, since it takes things from the Hoenn and Sinnoh games as well, and there's no better way of displaying how lackluster these games are on their own than how they begin. In every single Pokemon entry, when you first click on New Game, the very first person you will see will be the professor of the region, a brand new character introducing a brand new region and experience from the last. However, instead of seeing Professor Elm, the character who introduces you to the world of Pokemon is Professor Oak, the same guy that we first met last time. And that's basically these games in a nutshell. While other Pokemon titles make a lot of callbacks and references to Kanto, the Gold and Silver games need them in order to simply work, because if they never existed in the first place, Johto and these games as a whole would have zero presence whatsoever. Okay, I know Professor Magnolia doesn't show up in the Sword and Shield intro, but the difference here is Magnolia sucks. What I find pretty strange though is that fans are often very critical when it comes to these kinds of things, especially towards the modern games. Things like favoritism to Kanto or lack of depth in story are aspects that I and many other people have criticized Pokemon for, but when it comes to applying that exact same logic to Johto, people just turn a blind eye. And I just ask, why? Why is it that even though the Johto games have so many obvious flaws, that they get a complete pass by Pokemon fans compared to probably every other Pokemon game? Pokemon's a strange series in that no one really agrees as to what the best game is. And for the majority of the games, they go from being loved to meh to hated, back to being loved, and the cycle continues. But when it comes to the Johto games, I find that they don't really go through any of those stages, and that's mostly because of the time frame they came out in. The original Gold and Silver was the second entry in the franchise, and for a lot of people, that was their first Pokemon game. And when they were kids, they didn't see as many flaws, unlike if someone were to play them now. And that can be said for any other Pokemon game. But Gold and Silver also happened to be put in a very interesting position, since those games came out at the tail end of the Pokemon craze of the late 90s, also known as Pokemania, where you'd have a lot of returning players who bought Red and Blue experiencing those games, and they would also love it, due to, you know, more Pokemon, but also because of how much they had to do with the previous games. Being able to trade Pokemon from one another, and the regions literally being next door neighbors, made it feel like a natural sequel and a good conclusion to Pokemania as a whole. Since Ruby and Sapphire came out a couple years later, and those people who already played through the original Gen 2 games are now midway through their teens, and now are either burnt out or have completely grown out of their Pokemon phase entirely. And even in the early days of Pokemon discourse online, you can find posts of people saying Pokemon fell off after Gen 2. And now we flash forward years later when we finally got HeartGold and SoulSilver in 2010, which is no doubt the definitive way of experiencing these titles, improving on every aspect and adding features that couldn't be included on lesser hardware. And of course, those who played the originals would love what they did with the remakes. But HeartGold and SoulSilver are put into a very interesting position, since those games brought forth an entirely new fan base as well. Not only does it have the support from all the kids who experienced Pokemania, but now there's kids who were born in the early 2000s finally at that age to experience their own little Pokemania, and the Johto remakes came out at the perfect time to be a part of it. Because not only was there a 10-year wait in between the originals and the remakes, but it was also on a different console generation with a completely new install base. I decided to test this theory of mine when I put up a poll a couple weeks ago where I asked, what Pokemon game do you think is the best? And just as I expected, Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver won, since these games had the chance to be re-experienced for nostalgia by those who played the originals, and also by people who had the chance to play them as their first Pokemon game. Wait, hold on, one second, hold on. No, damn it! HeartGold and SoulSilver lost to Black and White? Fuck! Are you guys kidding me? You voted for the wrong thing! This completely changes my narrative! Shit. No. I can fix this. One second. I can fix this. So even though Pokemon Black and White was able to barely beat out HeartGold and SoulSilver, it is still a clear sign of how differently Pokemon games are perceived nowadays, due to how the kids who grew up on those games are a lot older and are now able to share their opinions online. Because if I did this sort of poll 10 years ago, Black and White would have most definitely been dead last, since the older Pokemon fans hated these games when they were first released, with fans criticizing about how linear it was, or how badly designed all the new Pokemon were, like we didn't get rocks with hands in Generation 1. But slowly, as the games and the kids who played them got older, they would come to be appreciated a lot more, because those kids can now form mostly coherent opinions online and can share them with other people who grew up in that same era, to the point where nowadays you'd look like a complete idiot if you didn't think Black and White were the best Pokemon games. And judging how most people who are subscribed to me are 18 to 34-year-olds, it would make sense as to why this era would get so much praise from Pokemon fans online today, especially since the Johto games had that opportunity twice, which now I feel is a pretty unfair advantage. The modern games have their own flaws for sure, but when the Johto games have those exact same flaws but do it in an even worse way, it makes me wonder what would happen if the circumstances were different. What if the Galar games and Johto games swapped release dates? Would people be willing to give Sword and Shield more of a pass? Or what if the entirety of the Kanto Post game was given to X and Y, while Gold and Silver had 5 fuck-ass looker missions? Would that automatically make those games the best in the series? The point is, Pokemon Gold, Silver, HeartGold, SoulSilver, and Crystal, I guess, are blessed with extremely good timing that no other Pokemon games can compare to, and are continued to be called the best games of the series, even though the story sucks, the Pokedex is incomplete, the Legendaries are underutilized, and the remakes, while good, are completely outperformed by what comes out later. These games check off the criteria that defines what makes a bad Pokemon game today, and yet they're still fondly remembered as one of the best the series has to offer, and that's the false reality of Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver. And yet, a big part of me still loves them. Damn it! Why do I keep doing this to myself? A little while ago, I was on a run with one of my friends, and I was telling him about this whole very long critique I was gonna make on Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver. And he said something along the lines of, "Oh, I enjoyed those games, what made them so bad?" And I started to talk about all these different topics and flaws or whatever. And after explaining most of it, he just told me, I don't even recall most of that stuff. I just remember how cool the whole summoning Ho-Oh sequence was." And then we proceed to trail off and talk about something else. But that last bit kinda stuck with me for quite a while. The first thing that came to my mind was, really, dude? Ho-Oh? Lugia is so much cooler. But the second thing that came to my mind was how Pokemon, and specifically this game, affected me as a kid. Because, yeah, Pokemon SoulSilver was the first Pokemon game I legally owned and beat. And I absolutely loved it as a kid, and didn't care about all these flaws or trivial things. I just simply had fun playing the game. And as I got older, I continued to believe that these games were a lot of fun. In fact, there is a significant portion of my life where if you asked me what my favorite Pokemon games were, I'd immediately point to these ones. And I would believe that Game Freak would never be able to replicate what they did with these games. But a lot of time has passed since then, and now that I've finally replayed the games for the first time in like 10 years probably, I now notice that these games have a lot more issues than I originally thought there'd be. Issues that should have definitely been addressed, given that this was the perfect opportunity to do all that, but just don't. Especially comparing them to a lot more ambitious remake in Oras, which might I just say deserves a lot more credit than they currently do. But despite making this hour or so critique, the whole point of this video is not to convince you that these games are horrible and you're an idiot for ever liking them, but more so that they deserve to be looked at with a more critical eye. But then again, people prioritize different aspects in what they consider to be a good Pokemon game. If you think these are the best games for having the most content, or just simply being the region that introduced Wooper, then damn, I can't really stop you if that's the case. But it does make me question how the current young audience looks at the modern games. Do they have the same critiques as we do, or are they simply just enjoying their experience and being enthralled by all the cool things those games have? And more specifically, when those kids get older, Are they gonna praise Brilliant Diamond, Shining Pearl, and Sword and Shield in the same way we currently praise Black 2 and White 2 and Platinum? I'm genuinely pretty curious to see how different or similar those conversations will be. And as for my personal feelings and how I feel about HeartGold and SoulSilver nowadays, it's complicated. I definitely don't hate the games by any means, but if I really sat down and thoroughly ranked all the mainline games, I don't know how high they'd place. So instead of giving them a final score, I instead relate my feelings to my thoughts on Meganium, the starter that I first picked when I played these games for the first time. Even though it is by far one of the most hated starters ever for how horrible its move pool is or how it gets utterly destroyed by everything in these games, and wow, that really became apparent when I chose it this time around because goddamn his stats are so bad and it dies from literally everything. But I still love the guy. It was the starter that appealed to me the most when I was a kid, and even though it clearly has flaws that I can't possibly ignore nowadays, I still love it for what it meant to me back then. And sadly, no matter how much I try to defend my favorite green leaf dinosaur, nothing will change the fact that it is fundamentally flawed, and it'll most likely never be properly fixed. And that's the depressing truth on Meganium. And the exact same thing can be said for Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver. Yeah, so this entire video is made so I can defend Meganium, because some of you guys are really mean towards him, and it made me really sad. God damn it, that took so much longer than I thought it was going to take. Originally, when I made the idea for this video, I was like, oh, it's going to take a couple weeks tops. It can't be that hard. And then the script got very long, and I got sidetracked with other stuff, and yada yada, we're here now. Thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, consider subscribing. It would really help me a lot. And if you didn't like the video, then tell me why in the comments below. I love engaging with you guys and seeing your different opinions on things I talked about. But if one thing's for sure, I hope we can all agree that Archer sucks ass.